All right, guys, welcome to the video. Today, we're going to talk about how Lucha Alex changed my approach to commander pairings, right? Once I discovered that pairing, a lot of the cardinal rules I thought before are like, hey, you have to essentially have the debuff go off before the active skill, right? You need two commanders with big active skills. A lot of things like that, it just went out the window, right? And then we'll kind of talk about how it actually can apply to potential Philip II pairings, which honestly, we don't know what's the best right now. All right, so overview, kind of quickly go over the LC Alex backstory. For me personally, we'll talk about some of the old models that I think some people still kind of hold on to that's just no longer true anymore. And then we'll go over, because of that, some of the theories I have. Some are more concrete than others, right? Like, for example, you can have a better commander that actually makes a worse pairing, right, than a worse commander. So like, a good example of that is like Alex is not as good of a commander as Scipio, right? But in my opinion, Lucha with Alex is better than Lucha Scipio. So that's not like that big of a stretch, right? Field reports does not equal to duel reports. Attack, the actual stat is, in my opinion, kind of underrated right now. The other one is that you probably actually want to have the big damage dealer go first, as opposed to the amplifier or the debuffer go first. Then the fifth one is the power of the instant proc. It's kind of crazy to me because instant proc is like one of these things where it's like people almost don't count it when you're looking at a commander's damage, right? William's a good example. Everyone says William doesn't do a lot of damage, but like it's like they almost forget that he has a 1500 damage factor instant proc, right? And then finally, what does this mean for Philip II? All right, so first, LC Alex backstory, right? So Lucha was actually released September 24, 2023, and it was pretty quickly that we discovered that Gorgo actually pairs very well with Lucha, but at the time, right, it was Scipio that actually paired the best with Lucha. Right, so I ran that March. It was by far the best March I've ever used up to that time, but I also had Guan, right? So if I couldn't pair Guan with Scipio, then what do? I actually made a video about this. You can see it on the screen over there, January 2023. I created my channel in December. So actually at that time, that was by far the most popular video I have ever released, right? And in that video, I talked about how I tried Guan with Mehmet for a while, and it did like, it was my worst March. It did okay. It was my worst March. I tried it with Guan Martel, which is like okay. And I even tried it with Guan Alex. And the trades were about the same for all three of them, but since Alex was the fastest, I decided to actually use that, right? And at the time, I still remember, because Scipio Lucha was so good and I didn't have Gorgo, it just didn't even occur to me that I could break those two up, because I had actually tried Alex Lucha at the time, and it was also kind of mid. It wasn't that good, right? So at the time, I still remember this specifically, and you can actually go look up Lucha Alex videos from back in the time. The people that were recommending potentially using Alex, one, because we have them, right? But they would always actually recommend that you run Alex primary with Lucha secondary. And it makes sense because Alex, when his active skill goes off, right, he actually has a really, really good debuff that makes 3 targets take 30% more damage for 4 seconds, right? So the whole idea is once that active skill goes off, 3 targets take 30% more damage, then you had the big 5-target AoE from Lucha come through, right? I actually accidentally stumbled upon this. I remember it was one of the last days we had fighting in our KVK. It was already over at that point. We lost. And I decided, hey, I'm going to make a video, and I want to make a video where I'm going to send, this was before I knew the reports manager was around. I actually don't even know if it was a thing at the time, right? But I was going to send my 6 marches out, right? And then once 2 or 3 of my marches are yellow, I'm going to pull all of them back. So I'm going to throw out any reports where it was just like a very, very short skirmish where there wasn't any kind of real like significant trades. I would only count the reports where there were significant trades, and I wanted to send 6 marches out, pull them back as soon as like 2 or 3 of the marches are yellow, right? And I want to look at them, and that's actually what I decided to do. I decided to do that to make a video, right? And it just occurred to me, why don't I just try running Guan Scipio and then Lucha Alex as opposed to Alex Lucha and see what happens, right? And the results shocked me, because even like from the limited reports I did get, overall the Lucha Alex just did the best, and my best equipment was actually on Guan Skip, right? And that's why I decided to make this video. I talked about it. As far as I know, I was the first one that actually talked about Lucia Alex as far as like, hey, look, the reports are really, really good. I'm actually sure that I wasn't the first one that discovered this March, because as soon as I made the video, I remember in the comments, a lot of people says, I've been on this like March for a while, but like people don't take it seriously. But as far as in the YouTube world, I was the first one that made a video talking about the reports and how they were shockingly good, right? And from discovering that, it's like my worldview essentially of how to do commander pairings change, because I just thought if you have Scipio Lucia and does really well, there's no way Lucia Alex could do as well, right? Just because if you compare the kit of Scipio and Alex, it just makes no sense, right? But like, as I saw more and more reports, and I got the reports manager, and then the trades were just better, right? And like, you can't argue with the reports manager when it's just compiling the reports. I slowly came to the conclusion that Lucia Alex is the best March. And even now, I still think Lucia Alex is better than Lucia William Wallace, better than Scipio Lucia, because to me, the three target 30% all damage taken debuff is better than any other debuff out there. And if you follow my channel for any amount of time, you know I value debuffs way more than buffs, because when you're debuffing an enemy for them to take more damage, it's not just one march, 2 march, 5 marches benefiting from it, right? Every march that hits it is going to benefit from it. So the actual utility or support that debuff is providing goes way beyond even like the marches you're controlling, right? Because if a march gets out of target and they are taking 30% more damage, they're actually going to melt even that much faster, right? So that's kind of the backstory there, and how I kind of like discovered this march, and it really changed my view on this. And I want to kind of share some of the stuff I discover from realizing, hey, you know what, Lucia Alex is a thing, right? So the old model, let's just go over 2 of the primary thought process before Lucia Alex was around. The first one was that you need 2 big damage dealers, right? So Honda Tadakatsu was a little bit before my time, but you know, I'm a nerd, so I watched a lot of the old videos. When I remember Honda came out, people would test them. The whole idea was that, okay, you want to run Honda primary, because Honda primary, you deal a lot more damage factor. I think it's 2,500, even though it has a way higher rage requirement, right? People ran it, and by the way, they were doing duels, right? It didn't do so well, so it was written off for a while. I don't know who discovered it, but all of a sudden it became more of a thing that, hey, Honda actually works really well as a universal secondary, and then he actually took off. And at one point, if you look at a lot of people's tier lists and stuff, he was considered a top 5 commander, you know, usually around 4th or 5th, because he's so universal. He has a 5 target AoE, and he has like march speed. He essentially could do almost all the things. At the time, a skill damage increase wasn't as important. Honda Tadakatsu actually became a lot more popular. But when he first came out initially, people were not high on him because they thought they had to run him as a primary, right? Another one is the whole like Gorgo Lucia thing, right? Gorgo Lucia, because okay, those, at least Gorgo offers again, at the time, a fairly high single target active skill, right? Even though there was mounting more and more evidence out there that LC Alex actually just performed better. It was faster, it performed better, as a better debuff than Gorgo LC. A lot of people were unable to move off of that, just because when they look at the damage factor, right? Gorgo does, I think 2,300, 2,500, whatever she does. LC just has Alex just has a 1,700 instant proc, right? So a lot of times people were just writing off the LC Alex March for a long time after that, right? The other one is the whole idea that you want the damage buffer to go first, or essentially the primary commander should be the one that actually does the debuff, so then the secondary commander can use the active skill and take advantage of that, right? So early game, you can see, you can look back on the old guides, right? Like a recommended march for the early game is Bjorn Sun Tzu, right? Because the Bjorn makes the target take more skill damage, and the whole idea of Sun Tzu's 5 target active skill is going to hit. By the way, I think based on my theory now, running Sun Tzu primary, Bjorn secondary, if you had a reports manager, it will actually probably end up doing better, right? When people are recommending the early game for Martel, right, when he does his shield, he actually also deals more damage, right? So you want that, and then you want Scipio to go second, because once Martel fires his active skill, you do more damage, then Scipio can actually take advantage of that and do more damage that way. By the way, I also think if you are going to run those 2 together, Scipio primary, Martel secondary will probably actually do better, right? This one I know for a fact. Even now, people are still recommending you run Scipio primary, Lucia secondary. The whole idea is Scipio 1 has a support tree, right? It's not as good as the skill tree, but it's better than the attack tree. And then 2, Scipio has a health debuff, so you want to debuff the target, and then LC will come in and clean it up. I've ran both for extensive period of time. LC primary, loot Scipio secondary trades better. I already mentioned Alex LC. Alex LC is kind of mid. I'll get into this maybe a little bit later. Oh, actually, I just talk about it now, right? But one of the reasons, besides that, you want probably the big active skill dealer to go first, in my opinion, is that when Alex actually fires off his active skill and the shield's active, you lose 40% attack and you're trading it for defense, right? So even though the target is taking 30% more damage because of his active skill, you're actually also losing 40% attack, right? So that could be a thing there. But regardless, I think at this point we all know LC primary does way better than Alex primary. And then this last one is also something I actually have like proof of in the reports manager. ZL primary, Boudica secondary does way better than the other way around, where Boudica is first, right? Boudica, if you look at her active skill, when it fires, it also makes the target take more skill damage. The whole idea is then ZL will come in and clean it up. ZL was broken when he was announced, right? We were all super excited to have him. I was super excited to run Boudica ZL. When I ran that March, it felt okay, right? It wasn't until way later on, after I discovered LC Alex, that I decided to flip it, ZL Boudica, ZL primary, Boudica secondary, and I actually ended up doing pretty well. I'll actually show reports manager screenshot of that, so you can actually see how it compares. Actually, it's right here, right? So you can see here, this is actually from my last KVK. You can see on the screen here, I ran Herman, YSG, I ran ZL Boudica. Those were my 2 Archer marches, and then when I went down to 1 March, I did ZL primary, Herman secondary, okay? Yes, the KP ratio, it's going to favor the ZL Boudica. Now, for context, when I was running the ZL Herman, I think I just ran all T5, so that's why you can see the kill ratio is a little bit higher for ZL Herman. But then when it comes to KP ratio, actually the ZL Boudica is the highest. Regardless, what I want you to get from this is, like, if you look at the screen here, right? Clearly, ZL Herman is the 2 best commanders. But when it comes to trades, it's not that clear that ZL Herman actually does that much better, if any better, than Herman YSG or ZL Boudica, right? So a lot of times you could have 2 really good commanders, you can pair them together, and it might not synergistically just produce the best results. That's kind of the point I want to get at, right? On the screen here, right? If I had to rate the commanders individually, Scipio would be ahead of Ragnar, would be ahead of William Wallace, would be ahead of Alex. But if I had to actually rank the pairing with Luchet, it would actually be Alex first, then Scipio, then William Wallace, and then Ragnar, right? Also, early on, people were trying to do Gorgo with Flavia, so we're just doing essentially everything but Constantine, right? Because Constantine's old, he's not a good garrison commander. But it wasn't until way later after Gorgo came out that people discovered, hey, Gorgo Constantine is actually probably the best pairing if you're not going to do an artifact KVK with Gorgo, okay? All of these things I'm presenting to you is just to kind of open up your idea of what a commander pairing should be and be more open to different possibilities, because if we just kind of closed our view and just had to stick with limited things where like it has to be the best commander, it has to be primary or secondary, we actually wouldn't have discovered a lot of these commander pairings, right? The next one is the theory is that field reports does not equal duel reports. That's obvious, right? But the way we're actually thinking a lot of times right now about how good a commander is duel reports, right? Because the testing is done for dueling, right? And we put them in the battle simulator, it's going to be dueling. And again, this is not to like crap on anyone, because like I actually thought the same thing at the time, right? It's more like through lessons learned and observation, you start realizing something different. But this is actually pulled from a video that came out around the time where before I made the Luce Alex video, and it was actually someone showing Alex Luce dueling Luce Alex. And guess what? The Alex Luce March actually outdueled the Luce Alex March, right? Even though we know Luce Alex is way better in the field, right? So you can actually have dueling results that show one thing, but then in the open field and the actual, like the way we do open fielding, the March actually does another thing, right? So a lot of times when you're thinking about commanders, or at least the way I do it now, is okay, um, how does this translate over to open fielding as opposed to just dueling, right? And then finally, here's something that's really important, right? Even when we're looking at reports, and I know I do this, I mean, the numbers in freaking red, right? I want to look at the sevs, right? How many sev wounds did I deal versus how many sev wounds did I take? And that's actually how I determine trades. Whereas if you think about actual open fielding, the sevs, they just show how efficient you are, right? And like ideally, yes, if you're more efficient, you'll trade better, you can make them use more resources and speeds than you use. But really what matters on the field is how many units you have remaining, or how many units they have remaining by the time one SAT faces, right? That's actually what matters, right? So for example, Attila is still really good at farming sets because his DPS is very slow, and I have a video I made about how subs work, right? When you actually just do white damage, as the health gets lower and lower, a higher percentage of the wounded is actually going to become sub wounds, right? Whereas if you actually do big skill damage, you're going to take less sub wounds, right? So one commander is actually way better at farming sevs, and the reports from a sev standpoint will look a lot better. But when it comes to open fielding, you want the higher DPS. It actually matters a lot more how quickly you could get someone off the field, and then how many units you have remaining when you do that, right? So I'm still going to look at sevs because that it looks cool, but I'm just kind of, again, bringing up some points where it is important to look at other stuff and really get, when you're looking at a report and you're caring about open field effectiveness, the number that really matters. And the one I actually have highlighted there in green, honestly, probably is more indicative and reflective of what good open fielding is than just the sub wounds. Next one, this is a theory, is that attack is underrated, right? So the reason why I think attack is underrated is because when we're talking about attack, defense, and health, we all know you want to value health most because that's the most rare. Then you want to value defense, and then you want to value attack, right? And you can actually show that in reports, right? But again, the way we're doing the reports is actually for the most part through duels, right? So in a dueling context, I would argue health is a lot more important. But I'm actually a lot more open now to the idea that if we're actually thinking not so much for duels, but for open fielding, there's a possibility where attack could be a lot more important, right? So for example, Alex, right? One of the reasons, there's a couple, one of the reasons why I think he actually pairs so well with Luce as a secondary is because if Luce goes first, then when Alex's active skill goes off, Luce actually gets the 70% of attack that Alex brings. But if Alex is going first and then Luce goes, then 40 is a 40%? No, 30% of that attack actually turns into defense, and you only get 40%. You actually lose 30% attack, right? So like when it's on the field though, right, you're going back and forth. When you have more attack, you do more white damage. You're not always just launching an active skill. You're not always just staying connected with the target. What if attack is actually a lot more valuable than we've been giving it credit for? And maybe in a dueling scenario, health and defense is a lot more valuable. When you're talking about open fielding effectiveness, it's actually attack. We've never done any testing, and it's really, really hard, right? Besides the reports manager, how do you really show that, right? And at this point, most people, especially like the experienced players, have already gone down the route prioritizing health and defense that I don't actually know if we're going to get a good test to definitively show that when you're talking about open field reports, attack actually is worse or it could be better, right? But like at the very least, I want to bring this up because I'm actually open to it maybe making a bigger difference than we think. I have brought it up before that I think for smite damage commanders specifically, attack is definitely more valuable than for skill damage commanders, right? Because if you're doing smite damage, the smite damage actually scales off of your normal damage increase, right? So you're essentially double dipping because when you have high attack for a skill damage commander, yes, like you're going to have your white damage, which is going to be 400 damage factor, then you're going to have the active skill, which is, however, whatever multiple, the 400, right? But when you actually have a smite damage commander that boosts normal damage, not only does your 400 damage factor white damage also get an increase, right? But then that also translates over to smite damage, which is your big active skill, which also gets an increase. So a skill damage commander doesn't benefit from attack as much as smite damage commander because of that. All right, the next one, I already alluded to this, right? And I already gave you enough examples. Okay, all four of these on the screen, Luce Alex, LC Scipio, William Wallace Luce, ZL Boudica, right? This I have like evidence from the report manager that when you run the bigger damage dealer first, it just trades better, okay? Now, I already showed you the screenshot where the Alex LC outduels LC Alex. I'm sure you could probably make some other cases where that happens. But when it comes to the reports manager in the open field, running LC primary or running ZL primary as opposed to Boudica primary is going to trade better, right? So one of my theories is that when you're actually deciding between commander pairings, if you're not sure, go with the actual bigger damage dealer first, right? Now, it isn't kind of anecdotal, and there could be some holes in this because I mentioned with the Alex pairing, right? If Alex is first, you also lose 40% attack, which is huge, right? In the case of William Wallace and LC, with William Wallace, actually, wait, that one, let me skip that one. Let me go to ZL Boudica, right? In the case of ZL Boudica and Boudica ZL, ZL has a really good rage engine, but it's actually only fully utilized when he's primary. When ZL ends up being secondary, you tend to actually stack the whole rage in onto one turn, and then you actually over rage a lot. Whereas when you have ZL as a primary, the rage engine actually spreads out over multiple turns, and it actually is way more effective, right? So that could be a reason why the ZL primary does better than the Boudica primary. That could be a reason why the LC primary does better than the Alex primary. But when it comes to, say, like LC Scipio, I have a much weaker case if I had to try to justify why LC primary does better. And it could be maybe because the attack tree is more suitable than the support tree. But that's a lot weaker, right? But at the very least, I hope people are at least open to the fact that maybe the big damage dealer going first is the way to go in the open field, even though you won't be able to prove that in dueling, right? And then same thing with the William Wallace Luchette, right? Like I'm not gonna even try to convince people at this point, but like it just like if you look at the reports manager, the LC primary just trades better, right? But people somehow fall in love with the smite tree and the rage reduction that happens with the smite tree, and they want to show that it works because if you do a duel, sure, maybe William Wallace primary would do better, but duels one-on-one, and also, yeah, like you're staying connected, you're reducing the rage. Whereas like in an open fielding context, I've seen enough evidence that LC primary actually does better than William Wallace secondary. Finally, let's talk about the power of instant proc. Okay, there's a lot of different ways I thought about presenting this, but the first, I just want to say it's kind of weird because it almost seems like when people are talking about damage, they ignore the instant proc of the commanders, right? Like it's like we almost forget Alex has an instant proc. William has an instant proc that if you're surrounding a target, it could be a 1500 damage factor instant proc, right? So everyone wants to point out to how low William's active skill is, right? But what if his active skill 1500, 3 targets, but let's just say you're hitting 1 target and the instant proc actually happens both within the same skill cycle. Now you're talking about 3000 damage factor, right? What if you're kind of doing your the usual ball thing where you're going back and forth and people actually don't get to fire off the active skill, but the instant proc gets to go off a few times? All of a sudden that becomes a lot more valuable, right? So one way I wanted to present it is to kind of present it as EV or expected value as opposed to just 1700, right? So the EV, and this is very, very common in sports, right? Like basically like pass per points per play, points per pass, right? Like points per shot, like things like that, where you could literally do a math and like figure this out, right? If this instant proc is 1700, right? Basically every single turn, because it's 10% turns to trigger, the EV is 170, right? So if you do 8 turns, which is about on average how long it takes if you're staying connected to launch your first active skill, right? It would be 1360. Right? Which is, people are like, oh, that's really low, right? But like a lot of times people fail to recognize that, okay, that is assuming you're in a dueling context, right? Because if you're staying connected, then of course you're going to fire every 8 turns. But if you're not staying connected, right, it's going to take a lot longer than that, right? So at some point, right, let's just assume the EV is 170, right? In real like open field fighting, right? You can see a scenario where as this number builds up, right, 170 per turn, damage factor per turn, the actual EV of the instant proc is going to outweigh the EV of the active skill, because you're guaranteed to have a chance to launch the instant proc every single turn, right? Whereas like for an active skill, you literally have to build up the rage. You could drop the rage. You can actually launch an active skill onto someone that was already really low. So like they were just going to die anyways. And it was kind of like, it's kind of gone to waste, right? Whereas like you don't need to build up rage. You could always fire an active skill whenever you whenever you connect. Right now, behind Luce, that actually becomes a lot more valuable, right? Because essentially every single turn, Luce is 100% going to launch the first basic attack and get a counterattack back. But then there's a 25% chance to launch a second or a combo attack, right? So that EV actually per turn will go up to 212.5 per turn as opposed to 170, which is one of like the hidden secrets, in my opinion, of why Alex behind Luce is so powerful. Now, I do have to put a caveat. There's an asterisk there, because Alex has a 3-second cooldown when he launches his active skill, and then William actually has a 5-second one, right? So the math, when you try to put that in, it becomes really, really complex. I'm actually not quite sure how to set it up to properly calculate it, right? So this like 170 per turn or 212.5 per turn is actually assuming there's no cooldown. So every turn, the probability is the same. Once you start changing the probability, essentially there's a cooldown every time you launch, it triggers, it actually starts making the math really complex, and I'm just not good enough of a mathematician to figure that out. But regardless, I just wanted to kind of point out, like, there's a hidden power in instant proc that it's almost like a lot of people just ignore. Like, people forget Belisarius Prime actually has an instant proc, right? It's a smaller one, but he still has one. And then one of the reasons why I decided to bring this up was because Philip also has the 3-target instant proc, right? So finally, what does this mean for Philip, right? So there's all these like numbers and stuff on the screen here. I think he's more likely than not going to be a secondary, right? The exception would be if he's paired with another leadership commander. So two that come to mind right now would be Hana Tadakatsu and Trajan, right? Now, for those two, maybe it'll be primary because they're also just leadership, right? And then the reason why he could potentially be primary for those two is because like Honda, like I mentioned earlier, when he's a primary, his active skill just takes too much rage. It takes too long, right? So like he probably is better, because if they're both more suited for a secondary, like, right, like again, you have to test it out. And I don't have Honda, so that's not a place I'm gonna go test it out. And the same thing with like Trajan and Philip, right? Like, you know, you can make a case where maybe Philip could be the primary with Trajan, right? But besides that, right, if kind of one of my theories hold true is that you want the bigger active skill to go first as opposed to the damage amplifier, then Philip will probably be a secondary. The other reason is because the leadership tree is just not good, right? So on the screen here, I have Ethelfled and Thutmose. Ethelfled because she has a leadership tree with a support tree. Thutmose because he has an archer tree with a support tree, right? And the reason why I picked the archer tree is just because I am probably going to try ZL with Philip behind him as my first pairing, right? That, like, I'm pretty confident it will at least do okay, right? And if you just look at the stats here, right, the archer tree just has better stats. But beyond that, from like the I forgot what the burning blood equivalent is on the archer tree. Like essentially every basic attack you gain 9 rage. When you look at the leadership tree, it's basically every time you're attacked, you gain like 6 rage or something. It's just worse. And there's a lot of stuff like that where the leadership tree straight up compared to the archer tree, it gives you less stats and it's just not as good, right? So that coupled with the fact that like there's enough evidence now that the bigger damage dealer going first actually works better than the damage amplifier going first. I think it's more likely than not that Philip will actually end up being a secondary. Always open to being wrong, right? But that's just a assumption right now. The other one is that he has a very, very high floor, right? And the reason why is because, one, he is a universal amplifier, right? So the closest thing we've had to him so far is actually Caesar with, I think, a single or double relic, right? Where you're dealing 20% all damage, and then he has some march speed, right? Philip is bringing 30% all damage with march speed, But then his active skill, right, which if you've seen the testing, it almost seems to trigger fairly often, could potentially boost the damage of this commander pairing by 70%, right? We never had a commander that actually boosts that much less like a one that's just a secondary commander, right? He has an instant proc. I talked about how valuable that is, and he brings March speed. So at the very least, he's going to be very universal with a high floor. And then there's a chance, I don't know it yet, because like we have to see open field and results, but there's a chance, or maybe you find another hidden gem, kind of like Luce Alex, and like maybe Philip will actually work really well with a commander that we're not kind of thinking about right now, or maybe we don't even expect him to be as good as, and you could potentially recreate another Luce Alex. By the way, one of the pairings that I'm really interested to see is actually Luce Philip. I don't want to say I'm confident, but at least I'm very hopeful that if Luce Alex works, I don't see why Luce Philip can't actually be better, right? So the next video, if you do watch it, it'll be shorter, and it's just like a fun video where we start speculating just different possible pairings out there for Philip. And then the video after that, with the stream after that, I actually want to test it with Toby in my kingdom. I don't want to release too much about that, but it'll be a fun way to test the Philip pairings. I haven't seen anyone else test it in that way yet. All right, so if you watch all the way to the end, you haven't yet, please like and subscribe to the video. Really helps out the channel. You usually should do this first, but I'm doing it at the end. Again, thank you guys for watching. I'll talk to you guys next time.